In the early years of World War II, the skies above Europe and the Pacific became battlegrounds where the outcome of nations would be decided not just by soldiers on the ground, but by the engineers and visionaries who dreamed of machines that could fly higher, faster, and deadlier than ever before. The story of the B-29 Superfortress did not begin with a bomb or a target or even an enemy, but with a vision, one shaped by the mounting needs of a global conflict and the sheer ambition of a country racing against time and tyranny. In 1939, even before the United States officially entered the war, the Army Air Corps issued a request for a new kind of bomber, one that could fly 5,000 miles, carry a 20,000-pound bomb load, and cruise at 400 miles per hour. At the time, these requirements seemed nearly impossible, but Boeing took up the challenge. The company, already known for its B-17 Flying Fortress, began designing something bigger, more advanced, and far more capable. What followed was the most expensive aircraft development program of World War II, surpassed only by the Manhattan Project itself. Boeing's team began work on the XB-29 prototype in 1940. The aircraft that emerged was like nothing the world had seen before. It featured a fully pressurized cabin, something unheard of in bombers at the time, giving the crew comfort and safety at high altitudes. It had a remote-controlled gun system, allowing gunners to defend the plane from enemy fighters without exposing themselves. The aircraft's four right are 3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each delivered 2,200 horsepower, giving it the power to carry massive payloads over vast distances. But power came at a cost. The engines were complex, temperamental, and prone to overheating. The early test flights of the XB-29 were plagued by engine fires, landing gear malfunctions, and electrical failures. Tragedy struck on February 18, 1943, when test pilot Edmund T. Allen and his crew were killed during a test flight in Seattle after an engine caught fire. Yet the urgency of war pushed the program forward at a relentless pace. Despite its flaws, the B-29 was seen as a potential game-changer, and President Roosevelt himself ordered its continued production. The U.S. government invested over $3 billion into the program, a staggering sum at the time, and opened massive new factories in Wichita, Kansas, and Marietta, Georgia, dedicated solely to building the Superfortress. Thousands of workers, many of them women, labored around the clock to meet quotas. The pressure was immense, but so was the belief in what the aircraft could do. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan had expanded its empire across East Asia and the Pacific Islands, striking Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and forcing America into the war. The Pacific theater was brutal, defined by island-hopping campaigns, naval battles, and fanatical resistance. Unlike Europe, where strategic bombing was already decimating German cities, the vast distances in the Pacific posed a unique challenge. Existing American bombers lacked the range to strike the Japanese home islands from any safe base. But the B-29 promised to change that. With a range exceeding 3,000 miles and a bomb load large enough to devastate entire cities, the Superfortress became central to General Hap Arnold's vision of ending the war from the air. In 1944, as American forces captured the Mariana Islands, particularly Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, plans were made to deploy the B-29 from these newly acquired airstrips. The islands were close enough to Japan for the bomber to make the round trip, and soon the runways at North Field and Isley Field were filled with rows upon rows of the giant aircraft. The crews that flew them, part of the newly formed 20th Air Force under General Curtis LeMay, began a relentless campaign to burn Japanese cities to the ground. Initially, high-altitude daylight bombing runs were attempted, but strong jet stream winds, cloud cover, and mechanical failures reduced their effectiveness. LeMay made a radical decision. He ordered low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids using napalm and cluster bombs, hoping to ignite the wooden cities of Japan. The result was catastrophic. In March 1945, 334 B-29s dropped firebombs on Tokyo, killing over 100,000 civilians in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, surpassing even the later atomic bombings. Still, Japan refused to surrender. The war dragged on. While the B-29 had proven its worth as a terror from the skies, the cost was high. Mechanical issues continued to plague the aircraft. Many missions were lost not to enemy fire but to engine failures or accidents. The pressure on the crews was enormous. Long hours, intense heat, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of flak and fighters. Yet through it all, the Superfortress became a symbol of American air power. At the same time, in deep secrecy, a different kind of weapon was being born in the deserts of New Mexico. The Manhattan Project, led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, had one purpose: to create an atomic bomb before the Germans or Japanese could. Scientists at Los Alamos worked furiously, splitting atoms and refining uranium and plutonium into lethal devices of unimaginable power. But as their research progressed, a question emerged: how would they deliver the bomb? The answer was the B-29. Only it had the range, the speed, the altitude, and the size to carry the monstrous new weapon. But not just any B-29 could do it. A special unit would be formed, one that would train in secret, modify the aircraft, and prepare for a mission that would change the world forever. That unit would be called the 509th Composite Group, led by a quiet but determined pilot named Colonel Paul Tibbets. He had already proven himself in combat and was chosen personally by General Arnold to lead the atomic mission. Tibbets selected Wendover Army Airfield in Utah as his base of operations. Isolated, remote, and perfect for secrecy, Wendover became the testing ground for the aircraft, the bombs, and the crews. The B-29s assigned to the 509th were modified under a program codenamed Silverplate. Changes included removing defensive armaments to reduce weight, reinforcing the bomb bays, and installing special holding and release mechanisms for the new atomic devices. The aircraft that would carry the first atomic bomb was handpicked by Tibbets and named after his mother, Enola Gay. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the focus shifted entirely to Japan. Despite the devastation caused by incendiary raids, despite the collapse of its navy and the loss of territory, the Japanese government refused to surrender unconditionally. Allied leaders met at Potsdam and issued an ultimatum, the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's surrender or facing prompt and utter destruction. Japan ignored the threat. Meanwhile, on July 16, 1945, the world changed. In the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated in a test codenamed Trinity. The explosion lit up the desert like a second sun and sent a shockwave through history. President Harry Truman, newly sworn in after Roosevelt's death, now held the power to unleash destruction on a scale never before imagined. He gave the order. The first target would be the city of Hiroshima. In the final days of July 1945, preparations for the most secretive and consequential military mission in history moved into their final stage. While much of the world remained unaware, far from the front lines, in the dry heat of Wendover Field and the steaming airfields of Tinian Island in the Pacific, a small group of men rehearsed for a mission they could barely comprehend. The aircraft had been selected, the bomb had been assembled, and the crew had been briefed, though most of them still did not know the full magnitude of the weapon they were about to deliver. The B-29 Superfortress, named Enola Gay, tail number 44 to 86,292, gleamed under the tropical sun, her modifications complete, her systems checked and rechecked by engineers who had poured months of work into preparing her for a single flight. Inside the bomb bay was a weapon unlike anything ever built by mankind. It was codenamed Little Boy, a gun-type fission bomb using uranium-235. The principle was horrifyingly simple. Fire one subcritical mass of uranium into another using an explosive charge, and the result would be a runaway nuclear chain reaction, releasing the explosive energy of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The final assembly of Little Boy took place on Tinian, where the bomb's components had been shipped separately for security. A team of Manhattan Project scientists, including Navy Captain William Deke Parsons, who would serve as weaponeer on the flight, worked day and night to ready the bomb. The final insertion of the explosive firing mechanism was delayed until the last moment to prevent accidental detonation. On August 5, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets assembled his crew and informed them of their true mission. Though they had trained for weeks, some still suspected they were delivering an oversized conventional bomb. Now they learned the truth. They were to carry and drop the world's first atomic bomb on a Japanese city. There was no dramatic reaction, no panic, just stunned silence. And then, quietly, the men prepared. In the early hours of August 6th, as most of Tinian still slept, the crew of the Enola Gay moved into position. Captain Parsons climbed aboard with the bomb's firing mechanism, prepared to arm the device mid-flight. Flight engineer Wyatt Dusenbury checked the engines, navigator Theodore Van Kirk plotted the route, and bombardier Thomas Farabee reviewed the aiming procedures that had become second nature after hundreds of practice runs. The plane lifted off from the runway at 2:45 a.m., heavy with fuel and fate. Two other B-29s, the Great Artiste and a photographic aircraft named Necessary Evil, followed behind. Together they headed north, toward Japan, toward a target city named Hiroshima. Hiroshima was chosen for several reasons. It had military significance, serving as headquarters for the Japanese Second Army and housing thousands of troops. It had been largely untouched by previous bombing raids, making it a perfect canvas to measure the bomb's effects. And it was nestled between mountains, allowing the shockwave to rebound and amplify its destructive force. At 8:09 a.m., the Enola Gay reached the city and began its bombing run. In the nose of the aircraft, Farabee took aim through the Norden bomb site, lining up on the AIOI bridge, a distinctive T-shaped structure that would serve as the aiming point. Parsons, having completed the arming of the bomb just minutes before, sat tensely at his station. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened, and Little Boy dropped away into the morning air. It fell for 43 seconds. At 1,900 feet above the city, it detonated. In an instant, the heart of Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash of light. The temperature at ground zero soared to over 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. Buildings, people, and everything else within a 1-mile radius were vaporized. The shockwave rippled outward, flattening structures for miles, igniting fires that would merge into a giant firestorm, consuming everything in its path. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days and months from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. From the air, the crew of the Enola Gay could see the explosion, a vast, swirling cloud of smoke, fire, and debris rising into the sky. They felt the shockwave hit the plane twice. Van Kirk, the navigator, later recalled that the city simply disappeared. Tibbets and his men turned the plane and began the long flight back to Tinian. Behind them, Hiroshima burned. Back on the island, the crew was greeted as heroes, but the mood was strangely subdued. They had completed their mission, flawlessly and professionally, but the scale of the destruction they had unleashed was still sinking in. Photographs and films taken by Necessary Evil began to circulate among military planners. President Truman, who had been informed of the mission's success while aboard the USS Augusta en route to the United States, issued a statement to the world. He declared that a powerful new weapon had been used against Japan and warned that unless they surrendered, more would follow. The Japanese government was in chaos. The full extent of the destruction in Hiroshima was not immediately understood, even by Japan's military leadership. Reports of a new type of bomb began to emerge, but many believed it was merely exaggeration or propaganda. Nonetheless, debates began within the Supreme Council for the direction of the war about whether to surrender or continue fighting. Even in the face of such devastation, many hawkish leaders insisted on continuing the war, hoping for Soviet mediation or better surrender terms. But the Soviets had their own plans. On August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing Japanese forces in the region and delivering a psychological blow that rivaled the atomic bomb itself. The following day, August 9th, a second atomic bomb would be dropped on Nagasaki. But the plane that delivered it, Boxcar, would also be a B-29 Superfortress, and it too had its own story. Yet the central figure in all of this, the unifying thread, remained the aircraft itself. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a weapon of geopolitical transformation, a machine born of desperate ambition, brought into being by engineering genius, driven by the vast industrial might of a nation at total war. It had flown thousands of miles over open ocean, pierced the skies of Japan, and delivered a device that had only existed in theory a few years earlier. The mission to Hiroshima was more than a military operation. It was the moment modern warfare crossed into an entirely new era. But in the hours and days following the bombing, even as Hiroshima smoldered and the death toll mounted, questions were already beginning to rise. Was the use of the bomb necessary? Was Japan on the verge of surrender anyway? Could a demonstration have been enough? These questions would echo through history, debated by scholars, veterans, civilians, and politicians for decades to come. But for the crew of the Enola Gay, there was no time for philosophical reflection. They had another mission to prepare for, another city to target, another bomb to deliver. And once again, it would be the B-29 that carried it into the sky. The world, still reeling from the first atomic bomb, was about to witness the second. As the sun rose over the Pacific on the morning of August 9, 1945, the world stood on the brink of irreversible change. Only 3 days had passed since Hiroshima had vanished beneath a rising mushroom cloud, but already a second mission was underway. Another bomb, another city, another descent into destruction unlike anything the world had seen before. This time, the target was Nagasaki, an industrial port city nestled among hills on Japan's southern coast, home to shipyards, arms factories, and tens of thousands of civilians. But the original target that day had not been Nagasaki at all. The city of Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest arsenals and a key military supply center, was selected as the primary target for the second atomic bombing. The aircraft chosen for this mission was a B-29 Superfortress named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles W. Sweeney. Boxcar had been modified just like the Enola Gay, as part of the Silver Plate program, but unlike the Hiroshima mission, complications plagued the Nagasaki flight from the very beginning. The bomb itself, codenamed Fat Man, was a different design from Little Boy. It used plutonium, not uranium, and operated on an implosion principle, a hollow sphere of plutonium surrounded by high explosives designed to compress the core to a supercritical mass in a fraction of a second. This design was more complex but also more powerful, with a yield of approximately 21 kilotons. The bomb was bulky and required careful handling, and only one was available at the time. As dawn broke, Boxcar taxied down the runway at North Field on Tinny and with Fat Man locked inside. But almost immediately, trouble emerged. One of the aircraft's fuel pumps failed, leaving over 600 gallons of aviation fuel stranded in an inaccessible tank. Despite this, the crew pressed on, calculating that they still had just enough fuel to complete the mission if everything went exactly according to plan. Accompanying Boxcar were 2 other B-29s, the Great Artiste, which would carry scientific instruments, and a third observer aircraft, Big Stink, that never arrived at the rendezvous point. As the bombers climbed toward Japan, cloud cover over the target cities became a concern. By the time they reached Kokura, the primary target, the city was shrouded in haze and smoke from a previous bombing raid on nearby Yarada. The bombardier made 3 unsuccessful passes over the city, trying to visually confirm the target, as orders specified that the bomb had to be dropped visually, not by radar. On each pass, Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and the delay burned precious fuel. After 45 minutes of circling Kokura, Sweeney made the fateful decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Time was running out, fuel was low, and the weather was worsening. Nagasaki, too, was partially covered in clouds, but during the final approach, Bombardier Captain Kermit Behan glimpsed a break in the clouds and released the bomb. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated over the Urakami Valley, not the city center, which had been obscured by clouds. The terrain of Nagasaki, surrounded by hills, partially contained the blast, but even so, the destruction was catastrophic. In an instant, the bomb vaporized buildings, shattered windows miles away, and incinerated tens of thousands of lives. The initial blast killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly. Fires swept through the city, and radiation poisoned survivors, leading to thousands more deaths in the following weeks and years. Despite the confusion and challenges, the mission had succeeded. But Boxcar was now dangerously low on fuel. With no hope of returning to Tinian, Sweeney diverted the aircraft to Okinawa, where they made an emergency landing with nearly dry tanks, barely escaping disaster. As the smoke cleared over Nagasaki, the Japanese leadership faced a new and terrifying reality. The emperor, the generals, the ministers, each had their own interpretation of the events unfolding around them. Some still clung to hope for better surrender terms. Others wished to fight on, defend the homeland, and bleed the Allies into negotiations. But two atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and the relentless firebombing of Japanese cities forced a reckoning. For Emperor Hirohito, the time had come to speak. On August 15, 1945, he made a radio broadcast to the Japanese people, the first time any citizen had ever heard the voice of their divine ruler. In formal, archaic Japanese, he declared the need to endure the unendurable and surrender. The war was over. The reaction in the United States was one of celebration. People poured into the streets, cheering, crying, embracing strangers. The word victory was shouted in every city and town. In Times Square, sailors kissed nurses in iconic photographs, and church bells rang across the country. But amid the joy, the B-29 crews returned quietly to their bases. There were no parades for them. No medals were pinned that day. Most of the men were rotated out, given leave, or reassigned. Their mission had ended the deadliest war in human history, but they were haunted by what they had seen and what they had done. For the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the suffering was only beginning. The cities had been reduced to ashes. Survivors, known as hibakusha, lived with physical and psychological scars. Children were born with deformities. People who seemed healthy began to die from leukemia and other radiation-induced illnesses. The bombs had not only destroyed buildings, they had rewritten the very laws of warfare. The B-29 Superfortress, once a marvel of engineering, had become the grim symbol of a new age, the atomic age. Yet few could deny the aircraft's effectiveness. Over the course of the war, B-29s had flown more than 20,000 sorties, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, and played a decisive role in forcing Japan's surrender. But the shadow of the mushroom cloud would follow them forever. In the years following the war, the debate over the use of atomic bombs intensified. Some argued that the bombings saved millions of lives by avoiding a land invasion of Japan, which was projected to result in up to 1 million Allied and Japanese deaths. Others claimed Japan was already on the verge of surrender and that the bombings were unnecessary, immoral, and served more as a geopolitical warning to the Soviet Union than a military necessity. President Truman, who had authorized the use of the bombs, stood by his decision for the rest of his life. So did many of the pilots, engineers, and scientists involved. Yet others, including some Manhattan Project physicists like Leo Szilard and J. Robert Oppenheimer, expressed regret and concern about what they had helped unleash. Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The world had crossed a line, and the B-29 had carried it there. After the war, most B-29s were decommissioned, scrapped, or repurposed. Some were converted into reconnaissance planes. Others were used during the Korean War, but their moment of greatest impact had passed. Only a handful survive today in museums, their silver fuselages gleaming under artificial lights, silent witnesses to the day when the sky delivered fire and the world changed forever. Of those that remain, two are most well known. Enola Gay, restored and displayed at the Smithsonian Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, and Boxcar, displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. These machines, once feared and powerful, now sit behind ropes and glass, reminders not just of victory, but of the cost of war. Visitors come and stare, often in silence. They read the placards, examine the photographs, and try to grasp the enormity of what these aircraft did. For many, the image of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima and Nagasaki is inseparable from the sleek lines of the B-29. It is a paradoxical symbol of technological brilliance and moral uncertainty, of peace bought through annihilation, of a world that could no longer pretend it didn't know how far humanity could go. But behind every machine is a story of people. Engineers who pushed boundaries, factory workers who riveted metal, airmen who followed orders, and civilians who bore the consequences. The B-29 was not evil. It was not heroic. It was a tool, a reflection of its time, its fears, its hopes, and its tragedies. Its roar in the sky marked both an end and a beginning. The city of Hiroshima was still smoldering when word of the bombing reached Tokyo. At first, the Japanese leadership couldn't believe the scale of the devastation. Rumors of a single bomb leveling an entire city sounded impossible, until reconnaissance planes confirmed the truth. A firestorm had incinerated the heart of Hiroshima, and tens of thousands of civilians had perished in an instant. Emperor Hirohito and his cabinet were shaken, yet the military leadership still hesitated. They believed the Americans couldn't possibly have more of these terrible weapons. It was a bluff, they thought, a singular horror not easily repeated. But in the Mariana Islands at Tinian, a second B-29 had already been selected, and preparations were underway for another mission. This aircraft, known as Boxcar, was named after its commander, Captain Frederick Bach, though for this mission, it would be flown by Major Charles Sweeney. The crew was experienced, but the mission they were about to undertake was unlike any other. The second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was different from Little Boy. It used a plutonium core and an implosion mechanism rather than uranium and a gun-type design. It was bulkier, more complex, and significantly more powerful. While Little Boy had never been tested before use, Fat Man was based on the same design as the bomb detonated during the Trinity test in New Mexico just weeks earlier. August 9, 1945, Boxcar was loaded with its deadly cargo. The original target was the city of Kokura, an important arsenal and military manufacturing center. But as Boxcar reached the skies above Kokura, a dense cloud cover obscured the target. Despite multiple passes over the city, the bombardier could not get a visual lock. Fuel was running low. The crew, under orders to only bomb with visual confirmation, had to make a decision. The secondary target was Nagasaki. Time was short. They turned and headed south. Nagasaki was not the ideal target. Nestled between mountains, its industrial zone was narrow and hard to reach. It had been hit by conventional bombing raids before, but never severely. The Mitsubishi arms plant and the naval shipyard were the primary objectives. As the plane approached Nagasaki, clouds again threatened the mission. Just in time, a small break in the sky revealed a portion of the city below. The bombardier released the bomb. Fat Man detonated at 11:02 a.m., with an explosion equivalent to about 21 kilotons of TNT. The bomb missed its intended target by nearly 2 miles, but the effect was still catastrophic. The steep hills surrounding the city contained the blast somewhat, but the destruction was immense. A blinding flash engulfed the city center, followed by a roaring shockwave that flattened buildings and turned glass and debris into shrapnel. Tens of thousands perished instantly, and many more succumbed to injuries and radiation exposure in the days and weeks that followed. Back aboard Boxcar, the crew witnessed the same surreal, hellish mushroom cloud climbing into the sky. The flight back to Tinian was tense. The fuel situation was critical. With tanks nearly empty, Boxcar was forced to divert to Okinawa, landing on a partially constructed airstrip with one engine sputtering and barely enough gas to taxi. The mission was complete, but the emotional and moral weight settled heavily on everyone involved. What they had just done was unprecedented. They had seen 2 cities vaporized by the weapons they had delivered. In Tokyo, the effect of the second bomb was decisive. The cabinet met in emergency session. Arguments flared between those who still wanted to continue the war and those who saw no other option but surrender. Finally, Emperor Hirohito broke tradition and spoke directly. The war must end. On August 15th, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. The world reacted to the bombings with a mixture of awe, horror, and confusion. Some celebrated the end of the war, crediting the atomic bomb for saving millions of lives that might have been lost in a full-scale invasion of Japan. Others recoiled at the sheer scale of civilian casualties. Newspapers ran headlines about a new age of warfare. Scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project found themselves divided, some proud of their contribution, others haunted by the consequences. The B-29 had played a central role in it all. It wasn't just a plane, it was the most advanced bomber of its time, a weapon of massive reach and firepower. But in carrying the atomic bomb, it became more than that. It became a symbol of the terrible power mankind had unlocked. In the months that followed, images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to circulate more widely. Blackened ruins, burned survivors, shadows of people etched into walls by the blast. For many, it was their first real understanding of what nuclear war could mean. Back on Tinian, the crews of Enola Gay and Boxcar returned to a hero's welcome, but not without inner conflict. Men like Paul Tibbets and Charles Sweeney maintained that they were soldiers following orders, doing what was necessary to end the war. They stood by their missions even decades later. But among the crew members, feelings were more complex. Some expressed quiet regret. Some turned to faith. Others refused to speak of it ever again. As Japan rebuilt, the memory of the bombings became central to its identity. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were rebuilt into modern cities, but they also became living memorials. Peace parks, museums, and annual ceremonies reminded the world of the cost of war. Survivors, known as hibakusha, told their stories. They spoke of lost families, long illnesses, and hopes for a world without nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the B-29 itself was slowly phased out of active service. As jet technology advanced, newer bombers took its place. But its legacy was sealed. The Enola Gay was preserved in museums, restored to pristine condition, part tribute, part warning. It stood not only as a marvel of engineering, but as a silent witness to the day humanity crossed into a new and dangerous era. The firestorms of Tokyo, the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the roar of engines over the Pacific, all of it was now history. And yet, it was recent enough to live in memory. The B-29 had reshaped warfare, reshaped diplomacy, and reshaped the very idea of what one bomb could do. It had changed the world not with its guns or its armor, but with its cargo. And in the shadow of its wings, the Cold War began to take shape. The story of the B-29 Superfortress did not end with the cessation of hostilities in 1945, nor with the signing of the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see the bomber transform from a weapon of devastating war to a symbol of the dawn of the nuclear age and a catalyst for decades of geopolitical tension, scientific advancement, and deep moral debate. Following Japan's surrender, the once proud fleet of B-29s found itself in a rapidly changing military landscape. The urgent wartime demand for mass production diminished, and many airframes were quickly decommissioned and scrapped. However, the Superfortress was far from obsolete. The innovations that it embodied, from its pressurized cabin to its long-range capabilities and remote-controlled defensive armaments, set the stage for the evolution of strategic bombers that would dominate the Cold War airspace for decades. One of the first significant roles the B-29 assumed after the war was that of a peacetime reconnaissance and weather observation platform. Its high-altitude capabilities made it ideal for flying above storms and collecting valuable meteorological data. Some B-29s were converted into the WB-29 variant and tasked with probing the atmosphere, a precursor to modern weather reconnaissance. These missions contributed valuable scientific information and helped improve forecasting techniques, saving countless lives in the years that followed. Simultaneously, the geopolitical landscape shifted swiftly as tensions rose between the Allied powers. The United States and the Soviet Union, former wartime partners, quickly became adversaries in a struggle for global influence that would be known as the Cold War. The atomic bomb and the strategic bombers capable of delivering it, most notably the B-29, were central to the doctrine of deterrence that defined this uneasy peace. The Soviets, keenly aware of American technological advancements, were eager to develop their own strategic bomber fleet. During World War II, several B-29s had made emergency landings in Soviet territory, and the USSR seized the opportunity to study the aircraft extensively. The result was the Tupolev Tu-4, a near-identical reverse-engineered copy of the B-29 that became the backbone of the Soviet long-range bomber fleet in the late 1940s and early 1950s. This act of technological espionage marked the beginning of a tit-for-tat arms race that would shape much of the 20th century. Meanwhile, in the United States, the rapid advancement of jet engine technology meant that the piston-powered B-29 would soon be eclipsed by faster, more capable jet bombers. Yet, the Superfortress continued to serve as a crucial stopgap platform. Its improved successor, the B-50, was essentially an upgraded B-29 with more powerful engines and structural enhancements, allowing it to carry heavier payloads over longer distances. The B-50 itself paved the way for the jet-powered B-47 Stratojet and later the B-52 Superfortress, aircraft that symbolized American strategic might during the Cold War. The B-29's operational history extended beyond World War II. During the Korean War, it was pressed back into combat, conducting extensive bombing raids over North Korea. However, the advent of Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters introduced new threats that challenged the bomber's dominance. The B-29's slower speeds and relatively lower maneuverability made it vulnerable. Despite losses, crews adapted tactics and improved defensive measures, but the writing was on the wall for the piston bomber era. Culturally, the B-29 became an icon. Photographs and films of the Enola Gay and Bockscar, the two superfortresses that delivered the atomic bombs over Japan, were widely circulated. These images, paired with the stories of the crews who flew these missions, captured the public imagination. The aircraft were lauded for their technological sophistication and the role they played in ending the war. However, they also sparked controversy and moral reflection that persists to this day. The restoration and exhibition of these aircraft decades later, most notably the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, became focal points for public discourse about the use of nuclear weapons. Veterans, historians, survivors, and activists engaged in passionate debates about the morality, necessity, and consequences of the atomic bombings. Museums became spaces not only for honoring technological achievement, but for confronting the ethical complexities of wartime decisions and their human costs. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, carried the legacy in their personal stories of suffering and survival. They recounted the immediate horrors of the blasts, the agonizing burns, radiation sickness, and the long-term effects on their families and communities. Their testimonies humanized the abstract concept of nuclear war and provided a powerful counterpoint to the technical narratives of bomb development and deployment. Many hibakusha became advocates for nuclear disarmament and peace, traveling the world to share their experiences and warn against the dangers of atomic warfare. From a technical perspective, the B-29 was a marvel of engineering for its time. Its pressurized cabins were revolutionary, allowing crews to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet without succumbing to hypoxia. Remote-controlled gun turrets enabled gunners to defend the aircraft without exposing themselves to enemy fire, a concept ahead of its time that influenced future bomber designs. The challenges overcome in developing the B-29, from engine cooling to aerodynamics, pushed the boundaries of what was possible in 1940s aviation and laid the groundwork for subsequent generations of military aircraft. Beyond its role in warfare, the B-29 contributed to scientific advancement. It was a flying laboratory for high-altitude and long-duration flight experiments. It helped test early concepts in aerial refueling and navigation. It participated in weather reconnaissance missions and early missile tests. The data gathered and lessons learned from these flights informed not only military aviation but also the nascent space program that would emerge in the following decades. Today, a few B-29s remain preserved and maintained by dedicated organizations and museums. Aircraft like Fifi and Doc have been painstakingly restored to flying condition and serve as living history, flying in air shows and educational events around the world. When these bombers roar through the sky, they connect us to a pivotal moment in history, reminding us of both human ingenuity and the consequences of wielding great power. As the engines thunder overhead, spectators reflect on the paradox embodied by the B-29 Superfortress. It was a machine born from a desperate need for victory and built with extraordinary skill and innovation. It carried the weight of destruction on its wings and the hope of peace in its missions. The story of the B-29 is not one of simple triumph or tragedy, but a complex narrative that intertwines technology, strategy, ethics, and human experience. The legacy of the B-29 compels us to ask profound questions. How do societies balance the pursuit of technological progress with the ethical implications of their use? What responsibilities do we bear when creating weapons of immense destructive power? How can we learn from the past to prevent repeating the horrors of war? As the world continues to grapple with these issues in the 21st century, the B-29 remains a powerful symbol, a reminder of the heights and depths humanity can reach, sometimes simultaneously. Its story challenges us to remember history's lessons and to strive for a future where the power of technology is wielded wisely and peacefully.